President Trump has proclaimed this National Minority Enterprise Development Week, and Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross will be joining the president today at the White House at an awards ceremony. With our colleagues from radio, we now welcome Secretary Ross, coming to Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg Radio live from our Washington bureau. Welcome back to the program, Mr. Secretary. Good to have you.
Thank you. It's good to be on.
So this week devoted to National Minority Enterprise Development has been around for some time. This is not the first time you had the week. What's different this year from last year? Why is this different under a Trump administration?
Well, I think it's different for several reasons. First of all, the Trump administration is much more business-oriented in general than had been the previous administration. Second, many of the moves that are being made, particularly in the tax area, will directly benefit smaller companies. For example, most of those are now LLCs or limited partnerships or some other form of pass-through income vehicle. The Trump administration is proposing to cut the tax rate there from a peak of the individual rate of 39.6% down to 25%. Second, these are young companies growing, have to make capital expenditures, so the ability to write off capital expenditures immediately is going to be a very powerful boost to their cash flow. The third thing is that by giving awards to the folks that we will be doing today, we're emphasizing some of these spectacular successes that individual minority entrepreneurs have been able to achieve. And some of them are quite remarkable. But overall, these tend to be relatively small businesses. There are 946,246 minority enterprises in the U.S. that have paid employees. Those entities have a total of about 8 million employees and 1.1 trillion of revenues. So there's plenty of room for them to grow. And part of the role of the MBDA is to help facilitate that growth. It cooperates with the Small Business Association, and then in terms of the exports, it cooperates with another part of commerce, the Foreign Commercial Services, and those have counterparts in 100-some-odd cities and in 60 embassies overseas. So it's a very big, comprehensive package to try to help minority enterprises.
So you referred, Mr. Secretary, to some of the ways in which the tax reform plan that's been suggested might help minority enterprises. One of the issues, I think, in Washington today is what parts of the overall outline are sure to survive and which ones won't, the so-called red lines. The two things we've heard most specifically are middle-class tax cuts and taking the corporate rate down to 20%, which you referred to, for example, is the pass-through issue. Is that something that really the White House will press for and insist upon, will not compromise on?
Well, it certainly is part of the basic program, and it has been for quite some little while. It's an important element because of its impact on small business. And small business is also impacted by another reform that the president intends to put in, and that's the repeal of the death tax. It's bad enough to have to die. You shouldn't be fined for doing so. And that's a serious problem for small businesses, family businesses, particularly farms, which tend to be relatively illiquid and therefore have to be sold often just to pay the tax.
So there is a perception that, as you call the death tax, the estate tax, really benefits the very, very wealthy in the country. Do you disagree with that?
Well, the reason that it benefits people over a certain size is that everybody under that size has already been exempted. So the question is there any fairness to having just one portion of the population pay a death tax on values that largely have already been taxed? Most private businesses start out with very little capital, so by the time the entrepreneur dies, what's been built up is retained earnings on which tax has been paid, and therefore it's a little unfair to tax that twice.
It may be unfair or not, but is it possible to square the passion to get rid of the estate tax, on the one hand, with the press for middle-class tax cuts? It doesn't sound like the estate tax has much to do with the middle class.
Well, they're separate issues, but you could also argue, and we do argue, that reducing the corporate taxes, both the normal C corporation rate and the rate for the flow-throughs, that also benefits the middle class. Because when you think about the components of any business's costs, taxes one component, wages are another component, and materials and equipment are another final component. So to the degree that you have reduced the cost of one, it's very logical to think that there would be room to improve the amount allocated to some of the others, particularly wages.
Mr. Secretary, thus far what we hear from the administration as well as from Capitol Hill are the wonderful tax cuts everybody's going to get. There's not as much talk yet, at least, about how that's going to be paid for. As Secretary of Commerce, as really sort of the quarterback of the economic team for the White House, how concerned are you about some of the things we may have to do, such as cutting back on business interest rate deductions, such as cutting back on the favorable tax treatment given to 401k? Could that have an adverse effect on the economy?
Well, the president has announced that he intends to do away with a lot of the special gimmicks that have resulted in very low taxes for very high income bracket people. For example, there's the discussion about not giving a deduction for state and local income taxes. 80% of the benefits of that go to 20% of the population. So that's one that's very, very oriented toward the upper brackets. And that's an example of what the president is doing to reduce the discrepancies.
Wilbur, it's Jonathan here. Always great to catch up with you. Senator Bob Corker is doing the rounds on the U.S. networks today, and he said the following, that President Trump leaving tax overhaul to Congress would be the best way for us to have success. What do you say back to that, Wilbur?
Well, the Congress is being asked to draft the details of the programs. What the president put forward is a framework. It's a conceptual framework. It's his objectives. But there are lots and lots of details to be ironed out, and that very appropriately is the work of Congress, because those committees have to do all the little semicolons, all the little commas, all the little clauses, because that, at the end of the day, is what makes or breaks the tax code.
The Constitution, of course, ultimately gives it up to Congress to decide these things and propose something for the Senate to sign. In that sense, Senator Corker must be right. On the other hand, have you ever seen major legislation pass the Congress without firm and strong and persuasive leadership from the White House? Don't we need that leadership? Are we getting that in terms of this is what's important, this is what we'll give up on?
Well, the so-called Affordable Care Act under the Obama administration certainly had relatively little detailed guidance from the White House. It was basically done in the Congress, and that's the biggest piece of legislation from that administration.
So what is the next step? What is the timetable, do you think, Wilbur?
Well, we're hopeful to have this voted in by the end of this calendar year. And the budget resolutions that have been going through are a precursor to that, because in order to get the tax program through, we will need to avail ourselves of reconciliation. Reconciliation means that you basically only need 51 votes. And given the very partisan nature of Congress right now, anything that needs 60 votes is going to be very, very suspect. So the budget resolution and its provision that there can be a deficit up to $1.5 trillion over the 10-year CBO measuring period is a very important start.
Well, but just as a final question for you, the race for the Fed chair is heating up, and I've just wondered whether you've spoken to the president about who you think would make the best Fed chair for this country.
There have been discussions with a lot of us, and I'm not going to comment publicly on it until the president makes his determination. But he's asked for a wide variety of people to give him their opinions and their rationales.
Wilbur, it's always tough to pin you down and get an
choice.
answer, but I will put you on the spot. The front runners at the moment seem to be John Taylor and Jay Powell. Out of the two of them, would you be satisfied with either, and do you have a preference?
Well, as I said, I don't think I'm going to be discussing publicly the choices the president might make. It's a very important decision. He's taking it very, very seriously. He's doing very considerable vetting. I'm sure he'll come up with a well-founded decision.
Wilbur Ross, U.S. Commerce Secretary. Thank you very much, Wilbur, for being with us today. Great to have you back.
Thank you. Been good to be on again.